Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Malavikha Rajivmoorthy and today I will be talking about grain boundary engineering in metals from charge density analysis. A quick overview of grain boundaries in metals. If I have a metal block and I were to analyze one of the surfaces under a microscope, what I would get is a grain structure. Grains separate different atomic orientations and the boundaries of different grains are called as grain boundaries. These are inherent defects in a material and engineering these defects is of paramount importance to enhance the performance of materials. This nicely segues into the next concept that I would like to introduce, which is grain boundary engineering. Grain boundary engineering as a concept was introduced a few decades ago, and this stemmed from the realization by various experimentalists that some grain boundary structures, as highlighted in the micrograph, have superior properties than some others, and it is imperative to increase the fraction of these special boundaries to result in improved performance of the material. But there were certain drawbacks. There were certain grain boundary phenomena which were detrimental, for example, grain boundary embrittlement, and the problems like those still remained unsolved. And nobody understood the effects of solutes on grain boundary strength. Computationalists started analyzing the structure of these special boundaries and described them with the help of the coincident site lattice model. For example, if the red and the blue lattice represent two different orientations from two different grains, if we overlay them one on top of the other, some coincident sites by themselves form a lattice, and this represents the grain boundary structure. This was a very simplified model and had its own drawbacks in the sense that it was simplifying the grain boundary structure, and realistic grain boundaries are not all coincident site lattice boundaries. And computationalists associate properties with properties and not structure with properties. For example, the energy of the boundaries was associated with embrittlement and cohesion, whereas a more robust method of association for computational purposes would be structure property relationships. With the performance criterion in mind, these are the properties of the model. We must be able to extend it to general grain boundaries, represent the realistic behavior of boundaries, and the properties of the model must describe grain boundary properties. So the structure of the model, therefore, should be a representation of complex grain boundary structures, computationally efficient, and it has to have the ability to associate features of the structure to observable grain boundary properties. And therefore, we must have a means to describe the grain boundary structure and a tool to associate features of the structure with properties. This would be the process for deciding the model, and in today's talk, I will be concentrating only on the means to describe the grain boundary structure. Ashby and Spaepan in 1978 adopted a purely crystallographic approach to predicting grain boundary structure. They said that there are certain units that are packed along the grain boundary to describe its structure, and keep in mind these units are three-dimensional. And Ashby and Spaepan predicted that any grain boundary can be explained by a combination and an arrangement of what they predicted would be 9 unique units. And here I have a description of the 9 unique units, but we will be in particular looking at the trigonal cap prism for our results. These boundaries were then subjected to density functional theory calculations. The boundary that is represented by the trigonal cap prism, which is rotating here, is the sigma 5 FCC boundary, and the vertices of this boundary, as you can see in the right, carries the solvent atom, if you will. But of most importance is the charge density topology, which is indicated by the image in the right. And from the charge density topology, we can see that these atoms are connected by a network of bonds, and the cyan octahedral point represents a minimum in the charge density, which is, in other words, the solute segregation, interstitial solute segregation site inside a grain boundary. Remember that these units are embedded in a crystalline environment, and to consider its effect, we have to first take the unit and grow the cluster bigger and bigger to incorporate the crystalline environment around it to see what difference it makes to the energy of the central unit. This we will call as the perturbation energy of the central cluster. On plotting the perturbation energy difference as a function of cluster size, we can see that the 9-atom trigonal cap prism reaches stabilization. So we can confidently say that after a critical cluster size, the effect of the crystalline environment on the central trigonal cap prism is negligible. This is also in concert with the nearsightedness principle of electronic matter, which is a computational chemistry concept. To conclude, grain boundaries can be studied as non-periodic clusters. This is because after a critical cluster size, since the crystalline environment does not have an effect on the unit, it is possible for us to ignore this huge supercell constraint for complex boundaries. And we also identified solute segregation sites with the topology of the charge density, and with the help of the topology of the charge density, putting these solutes, different solutes in these sites, we can also uncover structure property relationships. By structure, I mean the structure of the charge density, and solute effects that are manifested in the charge density can also be discovered with the help of studying the deltahedral volume. Let's say I have iron and I would like to alloy it with carbon, which I know is a cohesive enhancer. Boron is also a cohesive enhancer and a common alloying element, whereas phosphorus is an embrittler at the boundaries. Using this technique, I can study the individualistic segregation behavior as well as co-segregation behavior at the boundaries in different concentration of solutes. Not only interstitial solutes, I can also study substitutional solutes like chromium and molybdenum by way of understanding what differences they impart in the electronic structure as they segregate to the boundaries. So I'd like to conclude by saying that this technique has huge implications not only in grain boundary engineering but also in alloy design. Thank you very much for listening.